Kyle woke up. He is famous. Kyle is host of the most popular talk show in recent memory, Stay Up Late with Kyle. Stay Up Late with Kyle has grown in popularity quickly in the last year, and the public has noticed. Inside has called Kyle a most excellent dumpy white man. Top Tech noted that Kyle is inspiring youth to explore STEM fields. Most other talk shows are dedicated to discussing Kyle and his personal details. Most online videos are best-of clips taken from Kyle's latest broadcast. The eye of the world is upon Kyle. Tonight is Kyle's most important guest interview yet. Stay Up Late with Kyle will be featuring Rachel May. She is a kind and lovely philanthropist. She is dear to the hearts of many. This interview requires preparation. Kyle cracked his eyes open, knowing today is his last chance to prepare for the interview. Kyle has 30 hours left. He must choose his actions wisely. Kyle wanted to access the pantry, but found it was locked with a small keyhole. Kyle opened the fridge, intending to find something to eat. Kyle pointed his neck directly upwards and hoisted the fridge on top of his face. Somehow, miraculously, he wrapped his mouth around the device. He started to swallow. In one slow, horrible movement, the fridge slid down Kyle's throat. After many gurgles, pops, and snaps, Kyle felt relatively sure the fridge would not come back out. Kyle wanted to access the pantry. Kyle quickly crouched down on the floor, realizing his immediate need for... Kyle started to pick between the fuzz of his bedroom carpet, hoping to catch a stray beetle or two. Soon, he had a small handful of various insects, dead and alive. Kyle stashed the wriggling mass for later use. Kyle approached his downstairs neighbor's door and knocked. A middle-aged woman named Gabby answered the door. "Good morning, neighbor," said Kyle cheerfully. Gabby looked at Kyle expectantly. "Gabby," asked Kyle, "tell me about yourself." Gabby stiffened. "Oh, she said, putting on a fake smile. "I just sit around here." "Yes, I don't get around much, never go out at night. I just stay here, right here." Gabby glared at Kyle. Convinced by Gabby's statement, Kyle bid her goodbye and returned to the street. Kyle hurried to the set. Sitting across from his host chair was a glamorous woman with an air of genuinity. As Kyle approached her, Rachel looked up and smiled. Rachel's smile quickly turned to shock as she realized Kyle had not put on clothes that day. Kyle waved and smiled broadly. Rachel uncomfortably averted her eyes. Kyle started making his rounds around the room, greeting each crew member, none of whom looked at him directly. As it became apparent that Kyle had no intention of leaving, Rachel made some excuses and exited the set. One by one, the crew followed suit. Kyle was left all alone. Kyle quickly crouched down on the floor. Kyle started to... Soon, he had a... Kyle stashed... Kyle decided to take some time to choose the perfect outfit, knowing how important appearance is. Kyle was unsure of what exactly caused him to decide to wear his armor, but it felt like the right thing to do. After much squeezing and sweating, Kyle managed to wrap the metal suit around his dumpy self. Kyle wrote down his first question. Kyle wrote down his second question. Kyle wrote down his third question. Kyle wrote down his last question. Kyle ripped his page of notes out of the notebook and got up from the desk. Kyle wanted to... The pantry door lock creaked as if it had... Instead of an assortment of canned goods and grains, Kyle's pantry stored... Kyle grabbed... Kyle... Sitting across from his host chair was a... As Kyle... "Good evening, Kyle," she said, looking him in the eyes. "I've been looking forward to being here." Kyle responded. "And I as well, Rachel," answered Kyle, extending his hand in greeting. "You are a most welcome guest." After other mild exchanges of pleasantries, Kyle and Rachel were prompted to take their places for the broadcast. A moment after seating, the studio lights brightened and the cameras clicked on. "Good evening, everyone," said Kyle, looking at the camera. "Welcome back to Stay Up Late with Kyle. Tonight, I have the pleasure of interviewing the lovely Rachel May, who needs no more introduction." Kyle motioned to Rachel, who smiled and waved at the camera. "Hello, Kyle," she said. "I'm glad to be here." In response, Kyle collapsed on the floor. From a combination of stressful preparation and not eating anything, Kyle had passed out. Nobody in the studio quite knew what to do with him. They began to poke Kyle in the back to see if he moved. After a while, they ended the broadcast, shut off the lights, and went home. Kyle was left face first on the floor. Kyle quickly crouched. Soon, Kyle decided to take some time to choose the perfect outfit, knowing how important appearance is. Kyle, after much Gabby? Kyle. "Oh, Rachel?" Gabby said. "She's a wonderful woman. Her generous acts have inspired more good work than bad." Gabby trailed off, not meeting Kyle's eyes. After several uncomfortable minutes of silence, Kyle turned around and left. Kyle asked the store attendant whether or not they offered any free samples to important customers. The attendant gave Kyle a confused and slightly vacant look. Kyle began to beg for a free sample. Wanting Kyle to leave, the attendant grabbed a decrepit phone meant for spare parts and held it out. Kyle firmly clamped his mouth around the outstretched phone, creating several punctures in the screen. Kyle grunted and yanked with his head until the attendant let go of the phone. The phone is now Kyle's to use forever. Kyle, sitting as Kyle. Good evening, Kyle. Kyle responded. And after other mild. Good evening. Kyle motioned in response. Kyle decided to take. Kyle opened the fridge. Kyle grabbed. Kyle walked over to the strange door in the hallway. Kyle decided it would, after smashing his features into solid wood for. Kyle. Hello. You. Kyle's ears began to ring from his concussion. Rachel looked at Kyle, slightly confused, but continued smiling. Before she noticed the glazed look in Kyle's eyes, the producer approached. Time to get started, he said, putting a hand on Kyle's shoulder. Let's get stationed. Kyle sat in the nearest chair, which was Rachel's. After a moment, Rachel hesitantly sat in the host chair. A moment after seating, the studio lights brightened and the cameras clicked on. Good morning, everyone, said Kyle. My name is... Kyle made a desperate effort to remember his name, or really anything. Kyle looked at Rachel. Do you know who I am? He asked. Who are you? Well, if you're not Kyle, I don't know who you are, Rachel smiled sweetly. Kyle made up his mind that he was probably Kyle. Well, he said, I'm Kyle. A long silence followed. Eventually, Rachel spoke again. And I'm Rachel. Hi, everyone. Hi, Rachel, said Kyle. So why are we here? Rachel was visibly worried. Ha ha, funny, she said. Weren't you planning on asking me any questions? I don't have any ideas, said Kyle. Kyle kept staring at Rachel. Someone coughed. Kyle looked around and noticed the crew. Who on earth are all of you? He asked. Kyle got out of his chair and walked off frame, leaving Rachel alone with millions of viewers. Rachel smiled at the camera nervously. Well, she said, let me tell you some knock-knock jokes. Eventually, the producer ended the broadcast early due to technical issues. Kyle woke up in his bed the next day, remembering nothing about what had happened. Kyle started to scroll through news articles on his phone. Stay Up Late with Kyle ranked #1 and #2 show on television. New East Bridge being constructed after being found to not actually exist. Authorities investigating. Another grand larceny and crime spree streak. Evidence points to perpetrator fleeing the country. Rachel May to unexpectedly leave the country on very, very long vacation after interview tonight. Who is the bug vigilante recently spotted pursuing larcenists? Kyle fails to show up to several charity events. Bug vigilante shows up to charity events with fresh-baked pastries. Donations flourish. Hot dogs making resurgence as fuel source for both humans and tugboats. Phone model recalled. Techno gym stores blame overuse by customers. Kyle's phone exploded in his hands from overuse. Kyle firmly pressed his ear into the carpet, hoping to hear some stray words from the neighbors below. I heard Rachel May is going on a trip out of the country soon. Oh, girlfriend, tell me more. Well, what I will tell you is that every night I don a mask that looks like a bug and fight misdoers. There was a stunned silence. Then a door opened and someone exited the neighbor's apartment. Kyle decided to... Kyle opened the fridge, intending to find something to eat. Kyle continued. Kyle hurried to the set. Sitting across from his host chair was a glamorous woman with an air. As Kyle... Good evening, Kyle responded. And after other mild exchanges... Good evening, everyone, said Kyle, looking at the camera. Welcome back to Stay Up Late with Kyle. Tonight, I have the... Kyle motioned to... Well, I'm sure we'll have a lot to discuss, so we might as well dive right in, said... I'm very ready, said Rachel with a winning smile. In a shock, Kyle realized he had never bothered to prepare any notes for the interview. Knowing he had the eyes of millions upon him, Kyle came up with a solution quickly. Kyle ejected from his seat and ran out of the studio as quickly as possible. After it became apparent that Kyle was not coming back, the producer ended the episode and everyone went home.
What are you so happy about?
Kyle miraculously crammed. Kyle opened the fridge. Kyle started after wadding it into a several minutes of crunching later. Kyle approached his downstairs neighbor's door and knocked. A middle-aged woman named Gabby answered the door. Good morning, neighbor, said Kyle cheerfully. Gabby, asked Kyle, are you the bug vigilante? For a moment, Gabby looked stunned, but then she realized his seriousness. Gabby nodded once. The door shut in Kyle's face. Sitting across, as Kyle approached her, Rachel looked up and smiled. Good? Kyle responded. And I as well, After other mild... A moment after seating, the studio lights bright. "Good evening, everybody," said Kyle. "My neighbor is a bug vigilante." With nothing more to say on the matter, he fell silent. Rachel, also on camera, stared at her hands and wondered when she was going to be introduced. The producer started cutting to different camera angles to break the tension. Kyle continued to remain silent and stare forward blankly. After several minutes, neighbor Gabby walked out onto set. "Hi, everyone," she said, smiling hollowly. "My name is Gabby, and I'm not a bug vigilante." False. Kyle looked at Gabby and then returned to staring forwards. Gabby began to reply, but was interrupted by a bug-shaped intercom on her belt.
"Bug girl,
It squawked.
a robbery's in progress on East 3rd. Report immediate."
Gabby threw the intercom on the... After a beat, she spoke tightly. "Something?" Gabby left the set. "Well," said Kyle, "that's all the time we have for tonight. Thanks for joining us, Rachel." Kyle got up, shook Rachel's hand again, and walked past the cameras, leaving her alone. Not knowing what else to do, the producer ended the broadcast. In the coming days, fans of both Rachel and Kyle dubbed this show as a masterpiece of television. Stay Up Late with Kyle's online pages were updated to reflect this broadcast as the most popular ever. Kyle's producer later tried to have Rachel on the show again, but she was very, very, very busy. Kyle woke up. Kyle decided to stay put and wither away. Kyle withered successfully and died. Kyle is now a ghost. This does not relieve him of his responsibilities. Kyle miraculously cranked. Kyle wrote down his first question. Kyle wrote down his... Kyle wrote... Kyle... Kyle construct... Kyle smashed his breakfast to a pulp using both fists. Kyle... Kyle grabbed... Kyle hurried to the set. Per normal, he ceased to be a ghost before he arrived. Sitting across from... Good? Kyle responded. Kyle's strength was interrupted by his producer telling him and Rachel that it was time to start the show. Kyle shoved his producer out of the way, spread his arms wide, and began to scream loudly. He began to rotate slowly, screaming throughout, lightly brushing his hands against the faces of Rachel and his producer. After several minutes, Kyle was finished. He slowly put his hands to his sides and smiled. "I'm ready," said Kyle. Rachel blinked at Kyle, shrugged, and walked over to her seat. A moment after seating, the studio lights brightened and the cameras clicked on. "Good evening, everyone," said Kyle, looking. Tonight, I have the... Kyle motioned to Rachel in response. From a combination of stress, nobody in the... After... Kyle's first decision of the morning, Kyle decided to stay. Kyle is now a ghost. Kyle decided to take some time to choose the perfect outfit, knowing... Kyle decided to stay put. Kyle. Kyle decided. Kyle quickly crouched down on the floor. Kyle started. Soon he had a. Kyle's. Kyle hurried to the set. Per normal, he's sitting across. As Kyle approached her, Rachel. Good evening, Kyle. Kyle responded. And I as well, Rachel, answered. After a moment after seating, the studio. Good. Tonight, Kyle. Well, I'm sure. Kyle produced the notes he had taken earlier. Hey, Rachel, ever eaten a raw egg whole? Asked Kyle. Like shell and all? Kyle continued. I have, like, a lot. It's really bad, though, so sometimes I spit it back up. There was a silence. It actually gets easier the more you do it, continued Kyle without losing momentum. So don't start, I say. Rachel chose not to answer and looked in another direction. Kyle asked another question. Rachel, do you feel guilty? Asked Kyle, hitting her with a hard question. Rachel raised her eyebrows. About what specifically, Kyle? Things. Things in general. Life. Rachel did not answer immediately. I think, she said, that everyone has things they regret, but those things aren't always what others would expect. Rachel folded her hands in her lap and didn't have anything more to say. Kyle asked another question. Rachel, am I a mother? Kyle looked at her very seriously. Rachel was visibly unsure of how to respond. Well, Kyle, I think you might be a better source of answering that question than I am. But do you think I'm a mother? Asked Kyle, pushing further. Rachel paused for a second before answering. I think you inspire youth to pursue STEM fields, she answered. Kyle asked another question. Do you ever smile? Spat Kyle. Like, seriously. Rachel stopped smiling. If you're going to be on the show, you need to smile, okay? Said Kyle, not smiling. You're here to get views, and you'll get more views if you smile. Here, I'll show you how. Kyle turned to the camera and gave the audience a huge, teeth-clenched, bug-eyed grimace. Rachel nodded and obviously wanted to move on. After reading his final question, Kyle looked up from his paper. Well, Rachel, he said, I think that's all I was planning on asking you. If that's the case, Kyle, may I ask you something in return? Asked Rachel, smiling one more time. do you prepare for your interviews in advance? Because you seem very together. Before Kyle could answer, the camera shut down. The broadcast was over. Kyle returned home knowing the interview had gone well. But as he lay in bed and drifted to sleep, he felt that perhaps something was still missing. Kyle woke up. Kyle quickly crouched down on the floor. Kyle began to comb through the damp piles of filth and mold on his floor in search of helpful items. After finding and eating a few bits of crumbs and old cheese, Kyle found something much more important. Indeed, it was the corpse of Harry, a friend that had gone missing years ago while at Kyle's house. Kyle was glad to see him again, but was unsure of whether to interrupt such an important day with Harry business. Kyle hoisted Harry onto his shoulder and took him outside. Kyle began dragging Harry's body down the street, drawing many, many stares. Kyle knew exactly where he needed to take Harry's corpse, on a lovely playdate, just the two of them. Kyle and Harry started at the arcade. Kyle used Harry's arms to operate the joysticks and push buttons. After 5 or 6 different games, the two friends had enough tickets for a single candy bar. They took their prize to the local park for eating. Kyle tried to feed some of the chocolate bar to Harry, but Harry seemed to not have an appetite. After eating, Kyle noticed a nearby playground. He dragged Harry over. Kyle tried to figure out a way to swing Harry onto the swing set, but, lacking the ability to grip, Harry kept falling out. Instead, Kyle started to lug Harry to the top of the slide and shove him down time and time again. Finally, Kyle took Harry to the movies to see as many popular films as their pocket change allowed. Kyle quickly found that he had no pocket change, so he searched through Harry's pockets until he found his wallet. Kyle bought 2 tickets to A Love Romance. After getting inside, Kyle left Harry to go find a restroom. By the time Kyle had finished using the restroom, he had forgotten that he brought Harry along. Kyle watched A Love Romance by himself. Harry's corpse sat on a bench in the atrium. While Kyle was in the movie, a beautiful thing happened. Harry's corpse, imbued with the power of friendship and love, was reanimated. Harry's old, rotten flesh gained color and life. His fingernails regrew. His missing eye came back. By the time the movie was over, Harry was able to greet Kyle with a large, friendly hug as his old self. Kyle was confused but delighted to have his long-lost friend meet him on his way out of the theater. The two made plans to get drinks together and parted ways for the day. Kyle returned home, forgetting about the interview with Rachel. Kyle decided. Kyle. 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 Kyle felt a sudden pull on his heart. Had he abandoned his job as a ghost? Was he fulfilling his spooky, ethereal role that he'd accepted while lying in bed this morning? Kyle realized he had no other choice. He must spend his day spooking about. Kyle decided he should make a plan about who or where he should spook. Kyle could think of nobody better to spook than himself. Kyle sat on the sidewalk and looked at the ground. He took a deep breath. Kyle began to scream uncontrollably, as he had managed to spook himself by his very existence. Kyle jumped up from the sidewalk and began to run around, flailing his arms. Unfortunately, Kyle was unable to escape from the fact that he was himself. Kyle spent several minutes screaming. But as he screamed, Kyle realized it was becoming time for Rachel's interview. Continuing to scream, Kyle traveled to his studio. That evening, Kyle tried to do well by his duties and conduct the interview with Rachel. But being able to only express pure terror, the episode consisted only of Rachel watching him scream. The episode was very popular. Kyle was asked to continue screaming in the next episode, and the next. Kyle's show was rebranded to Kyle is Scared with Kyle. The studio went on to produce many episodes. Kyle remained existentially terrified of himself. Kyle decided to take some time to... Kyle... Kyle wrote down... Kyle had... Was he... Kyle decided he should make a plan about who or where he should... Kyle thought that it would be best to continue his daily course, but with a twist. Today, he would still go to his studio, but instead of conducting an interview, he would haunt. Excitedly, Kyle made his way to the studio early to find the best spot to conduct his ghostly duties. The studio was empty. Being so early, the crew wouldn't arrive for several hours. Kyle gleefully skipped around the building, finding the best spot for himself to hide. After searching for some time, Kyle decided to hide behind the guest chair. Kyle quickly placed himself down and drew his legs to his chest. Soon, the crew began to arrive and set up for the interview that night. Invisible to all senses, Kyle went undetected. He watched as cameras were set up, screens were turned on, and pages were flipped. Within an hour, Rachel walked into the studio. "Hey, everyone," said Rachel, smiling kindly. "I'm ready to get prepped. Who do I need to talk to first?" Kyle's producer approached her.
Thanks for being here, Rachel. You should really talk to Andrea about makeup first, and then wait for when Kyle arrives.
Kyle, knowing he was duping everyone, began to giggle uncontrollably. It was then that he, like clockwork, ceased to be a ghost. The studio grew silent. Everyone stared at Kyle, head down, clutching his legs and giggling at the floor. Kyle froze. He had found himself in a situation he had not encountered before. Kyle started to crawl out of the studio on all fours, hoping his small form would avoid attracting more attention. Everyone wordlessly watched as Kyle slowly made his way across the stage, through the production set, and out the door. As soon as he was outside the studio, Kyle broke into an all-out sprint. Kyle made his way back to his apartment as quickly as possible. Kyle sat in his kitchen and processed what had happened during his day. He vowed that he would never haunt anything again. Kyle is... Kyle... Had he... Was he Kyle believed that Gabby would be delighted to have him spook about a bit. Kyle started to slowly creep to Gabby's door in a very spooky way. He crouched by Gabby's door, cooing quietly and waiting for her to leave so he could cause her a spook. It didn't take long. Soon, Gabby exited her apartment and started walking towards her car. Kyle crept behind her, invisible to all senses. Gabby opened the driver's side door and got in. She seemed to be leaving for some errands. Kyle was struck with a wonderful idea. Kyle started to run to the back of Gabby's car. Perhaps if he could catch her before she left, he could hide in the trunk. Kyle could make noises as she drove. He could follow her around on her errand, knocking over small objects nearby. Gabby put the car in reverse and floored the accelerator. Invisible to all senses, Kyle was crushed underneath the back tires of the car, creating a large boom. Gabby figured she'd hit the curb. She put the car into forward and floored the accelerator again. Kyle became locked in an endless loop of Gabby trying to move her car out of her parking space, being run over repeatedly. As the day started to wane and it drew closer to the time of Rachel's interview, Kyle ceased to be a ghost. Gabby neither noticed nor stopped. Kyle was forced to conduct Rachel's interview while being run over. Kyle's crew moved the filming set next to Gabby's apartment. Rachel appeared. Kyle asked her many questions. They shared several laughs. The interview was successful. The sound of Gabby flooring her car's accelerator drowned out large sections of the episode. Kyle woke up. Kyle grabbed the small... Kyle decided... Kyle knelt down and... Kyle wanted... The pantry door... Instead of an assortment of canned goods and grains, Kyle's pantry... Kyle voraciously grabbed the closest bottle, snapped the neck... Kyle wildly sucked down another bottle. He felt Kyle's vomit in the lard. As Kyle finished the last bottle of lard... Kyle wanted to act... Instead of an assortment of canned goods and grains, Kyle's pantries... Kyle's vomit in the... As Kyle finished... Kyle, sitting across from his host... As... Good? Kyle responded. Kyle was interrupted by... Kyle! He began to... Rachel blinked. A moment. Good. Kyle vomited all of the horrible things he had eaten earlier onto the floor. Rachel looked at Kyle, concerned, gave a couple coughs, and decided to play it cool and keep the show running. Kyle stopped, then vomited again, then continued with a shaky voice. Tonight, I have the pleasure of interviewing the lovely Rachel May, who needs no more introduction. However, said Kyle, suddenly dropping his voice, Rachel May is not sitting next to me. She is not new to this show. She did not walk in before me. In fact, said Kyle, I am Rachel. Rachel looked at Kyle, confused, and silently mouthed the words, You are who? Kyle stood up quickly and threw his arm high above him, pointing upwards. I have never been, Kyle, he proclaimed. I have never been the host of the show Stay Up Late with Kyle. Kyle looked and pointed directly at the camera. I am here for but one reason, to interview myself. Kyle sat down in his chair and went to produce the notes he had taken earlier. It was then that Kyle remembered that he had not bothered to prepare any notes for the interview. Realizing he did not know how to... Firstly, he said, Is your name Kyle? No! Kyle slammed his fist down repeatedly. Then he stopped talking. A thick, uncomfortable silence hung over the studio. The silence did not end. The cameras continued to roll. Nobody moved or spoke. Eventually, Rachel got out of her chair and walked off screen. One by one, members of the crew followed suit. Eventually, Kyle was left. This episode of Stay Up Late with Kyle became... Kyle continued to sit as evening fell again. Kyle continued to sit motionless, cameras rolling, as the crew chatted about their days and got in position. Eventually, the crew officially started the next episode. Kyle was prompted to introduce himself again. Kyle had produced an incredibly artistic episode. Kyle chose the pink. Getting the slimy garments to stay proved difficult, so Kyle approached his downstairs neighbor's door and knocked. A middle-aged woman named Gabby answered the door. Kyle unhinged his jaw and swallowed Gabby whole. Job done, Kyle returned to the middle of the street. This phone, said Kyle, is several years old and has exposed wires coming out of the back. Kyle continued. Also, the screen has had issues ever since I used it to hammer nails into the wall. Furthermore, when I submerge it in water, I get severely shocked until it runs out of battery. The attendant looked at Kyle, pursed his lips, and said nothing. Feeling he had made his argument, Kyle decided to leave. Quickly, before the attendant could acknowledge him, finding that Techno Jim's cardboard feet were... After several tugs, Techno Jim broke free, leaving one foot and one leg behind. Kyle glanced at the attendant, who was staring, bewildered, and ran outside. Kyle hurried to the set. Sitting across from his host... Good evening, Kyle, she said, looking him in the eyes. I've been looking forward to being here. Kyle responded. And I as well. Good evening. Kyle motioned. Well, I'm sure we'll... Knowing he had the... Kyle slumped in his seat and played dead. Kyle, what are you up to? Asked Rachel. Kyle did not respond and hoped nobody would ask questions. Kyle, why are you pretending to be dead? Asked Rachel. I can see you breathing. Kyle held his breath. The producer whispered to Rachel over her earpiece. Give a couple slaps across the face and see if he wakes up. Rachel got up from her chair, walked to Kyle, and slapped him firmly across the face. Rachel slapped Kyle continuously, trying to get him to stop play acting. Other members of the crew stepped into frame to start slapping Kyle as well. Soon, Kyle was lost in the amassment of people around him, all slapping his face with both hands. The slapping went on for many hours. Kyle did not wake up. Eventually, Kyle did not need to pretend to be unconscious. Kyle, as Kyle approached. Good evening. Kyle roughly shoved Rachel out of her seat and placed Techno Jim in her stead. Hello, Techno Jim, said Kyle. I'm going to interview you today. Kyle grasped Techno Jim's hand and tried to shake it, but instead tore it off the cardboard frame. Kyle's producer, sensing viral media, pulled the bewildered Rachel out of frame and motioned the crew to go live. Cameramen moved, lights flashed, and suddenly the studio was on air. Hi, I'm Kyle, said Kyle, and tonight I'm going to interview a very special guest. He pointed at Techno Jim using the dismembered arm. Techno Jim started to smoke from the heat of the lights. Would you like to introduce yourself? Asked. Knowing Jim would probably not speak, Kyle took it upon himself to be his voice as well. Hi, Kyle, he said, raising the pitch of his voice. My name is Rachel May, and I'm a very special guest. Rachel's expression of confusion turned to shock. Well, Rachel, you look way too thin and absolutely terrible, and you should feel ugly. Kyle gave Jim a meaningful stare. Wow, Kyle, he said. I sure wish I could look like you. Techno Jim burst into flames. Instantaneously, the sprinkler system initiated. Curtains of water poured down from the rafters. Within seconds, the production equipment was doused in water. The set was soon aburst with electrical fires. Kyle's crew abandoned their posts as cameramen and sound mixers to try to put the fires out. As the crew scrambled around, the cameras continued to run. Kyle sat, motionless, staring. Eventually, the fires were all put out. Kyle's producer shut off the broadcast, leaving Kyle's vacant stare as the final frame. Kyle's ratings skyrocketed. Techno Jim became a staple on the show, often ending up destroyed by the end of each episode. Although Rachel did not come back on the show, her cardboard portrayal did. Rachel was very popular. Kyle, sitting Good evening, Kyle. Kyle responded. And I... Knowing he had the eyes of Rachel, I need to be honest. You're not terribly interesting, and I could not think of what I should ask you. In fact, continued Kyle, I would far rather interview a fish than I would you. And furthermore, said Kyle, I'm not sure I could tell the difference between a you and a fish. Kyle leaned back in his chair and desperately hoped the blame had been shifted adequately. Rachel glowered at Kyle. Kyle glowered back. Rachel left the studio. Kyle no longer had a guest and spent the next 42 minutes staring at the camera silently. Kyle wrote down his first question. Kyle wrote down his second question. Kyle wrote down... Kyle... Kyle decided to take some time. Kyle... quickly finding Kyle. Kyle sitting as good evening, Kyle. Hello. Cap. Hi. He pointed. Techno Jim started to smoke from the heat of the lights. Would you like to introduce yourself? Knowing Jim would probably not speak. Hi. Rachel? Well, Rachel, you look way too... Techno... Instant... Tech... Sitting as Kyle approached. Good evening. Kyle responded. Was Kyle shut? He began to rotate. After... Rachel blinked at... A moment. Good. Tonight, Kyle... Well, I'm very ready. Kyle produced the notes he had taken earlier. We all have one. What's your guilt? Ooh! It might sound strange, but it's tangy and sweet at the same time. I eat it far too often. Rachel smiled sweetly. Kyle asked. Rachel, I and many others would love to know, are you a mother? Kyle looked up from his notes. Well, being a single woman with a career, she answered, that's not something that has crossed my mind. Rachel, very reasonable indeed. Kyle asked another question. You've been involved in a lot of different things, said Kyle, but what's your funniest story? Well, that's a great question, Kyle, said Rachel. I think the story I always remember is the first time I tried to make dinner for my family. In the soup I made, I swapped out the water with milk and tipped the whole jar of salt in the pot. While my family was sick from trying to eat it, I swiped their things and locked myself in my room. Rachel laughed elegantly. Kyle decided to move on. Rachel, you managed... Well, a good diet starts with a plan, answered Rachel, and don't break it. But, she continued, that doesn't mean a midnight snack here and there isn't allowed. Kyle looked at his flabby self, decided not to comment, and moved on. After reading his final question, well, Ray, why exactly did you decide to wear swimming goggles today? Before Kyle could answer, but as he lay in... Kyle quickly crouched down on the floor, realizing his immediate need for... Kyle decided to take some... Kyle walked over to the strange door in the hallway, but found... Kyle wrote... Kyle decided... Kyle approached a middle-aged woman named Gabby and... Kyle, sitting... Hello. Rachel... Kyle sat in the nearest... Kyle made a Eventually, Rachel was visibly worried. Ha ha, funny, she said. Weren't you planning on asking me any questions? I mean, I don't have any ideas. Kyle kept staring at Rachel. Someone coughed. Kyle looked around and noticed... Who on earth... Rachel... Kyle decided it would be after smashing his feet. Kyle approached his downstairs neighbor's door and knocked. A middle-aged woman named Gabby answered. "Good morning, neighbor," said Kyle cheerfully. "Gabby." "Gabby," Kyle asked very earnestly, "how do you feel about me?" The expectation on Gabby's face transformed into consternation. "Even the worst of men are given grace, Kyle," she replied, "though they don't deserve it." As she finished her sentence, this phone. As good, Kyle responded. Kyle started. Kyle. Kyle quickly crouched down on the floor. Kyle decided to take. Kyle. Kyle wanted to act. Instead of an. Kyle. 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 A middle-aged. Slowly, Kyle started. He tilted his neck upwards and let loose a long passion. As Kyle continued to spin, Gabby shut and locked her door, as she did every time Kyle screamed outside her door. Eventually, Kyle ran out of breath and fell over. Kyle, sitting across from his. As Kyle. Good. Kyle. Good. Kyle vomited all of. Rachel looked. Kyle. "Tonight, I have the pleasure of interviewing the lovely." As Rachel started to reply, Kyle clamped his hand over her mouth. "Hush," he said. "I need to do something before we can continue." Kyle removed the CD he had brought to the interview and placed it in a nearby player deck. The sound system kicked into action, piping Kyle's music throughout the studio. Rachel briefly listened, a blank expression on her face. Smiling, Kyle closed his eyes and enjoyed the music for a moment. Then, "All right, now everything's ready." In a shock, Kyle realized he had never bothered to prepare any notes for the interview. Knowing he had the eyes of millions upon him, Kyle came up with a solution. After Kyle's first decision of the morning was made. Kyle decided. Kyle wrote down his. Kyle wrote down his. Kyle wrote down. Kyle wrote down his last. Kyle ripped his. Kyle. Kyle ate it. Kyle. A middle-aged woman named Gabby answered the door. Kyle sitting. Goody. Kyle responded. Good. Tonight, I have the pleasure of interviewing the lovely. Kyle. This. So, said Kyle, my mother is a mother. My mother's mother is her mother and my mother's mother. I'm sorry, Kyle, said Rachel. What on earth is this music? It's very... well, it's something. It's an old favorite, Rachel, said Kyle. This is what I grew up on. It's part of my... Kyle and Rachel sat silently, the music playing in the background. Rachel began to frown. Suddenly, the wall next to Kyle exploded. Through the hole stepped several men in dazzling, flamboyant costumes of bright color. They held guitars, pianos, and other instruments.
Kyle,
Said the man in front.
we are the band of your childhood.
Kyle's jaw dropped, smiling. He put his hands to his cheeks. His eyes sparkled.
We have come to issue a grievance about playing our music on TV without a license.
The man took his guitar in both hands and began slamming Kyle's face repeatedly. After several hours, the grievance had been sufficiently repaid. The band left through the hole they had created in the wall. Kyle lay on the floor, thinking about what had happened. Rachel slowly slid to his side. Are you feeling okay, Kyle? She asked. She had a concerned expression on her face. Have you ever met your childhood idol, Rachel? Asked Kyle. The person you looked up to for as long as you can remember. I can't say I have, said Rachel. Kyle raised both fists into the air.
It feels amazing!
Kyle spent the rest of Rachel's interview chatting happily about meeting his lifelong favorite band. Rachel listened and asked questions politely, seeming unfazed that her moment on TV had been uprooted. Eventually, the studio was out of time and the broadcast shut off. Kyle and Rachel walked out of the studio together. Kyle was grinning widely. The two said their goodbyes and walked off in separate directions. As Kyle walked home, he felt like the interview had been everything he had hoped it to be. Kyle had gotten everything he had ever wanted as a child.